I'm Allison from Learning at the Primary Pond. I'm a literacy specialist, and in this video, I'm going to go over the 3 types of connections that we might have our students make when we are working on reading comprehension with them. All of these types of connections support students' understanding of a text. And in addition to explaining the 3 types of connections, I'm also going to give you practical strategies so that you can practice these with your students in the classroom. Before we dive in, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the little bell so that you're notified every time I post a brand new video about teaching literacy in K2. Okay, so the 3 types of connections we're going to go over are text to self, T to S for short, text to text, and text to world. And again, the whole purpose of helping them make these connections is to facilitate their comprehension of a text, because you know, when kids read a text, or when any reader reads a text, they're seeing the stuff in the text itself, but it's fitting into their larger understanding of how the world works, ideas that they have, their own lives. So that's why proficient readers make connections all the time to better understand a text, and it's something that we want our students to do as well. By the way, these examples are really going to be focused on K2, but you can absolutely work on these skills at higher grade levels. You would just maybe like up the ante, make them a little bit more sophisticated. Okay, so let's start with text to self connections. These are typically a good place to start just because they're a little bit easier than other types of connections, although as I'll talk about in a minute, sometimes it's easier to make superficial text to self connections than it is to really dig deeper here. But basically, a text to self connection is when students are reminded of a personal experience when they're reading some kind of text. So an event, a character, like even an emotion in the book experienced by a character is somehow prompting the student to recall something that happened in their own real lives. So for example, maybe you're reading students a book about giraffes or just animals in general, and a student says, you know, I saw a giraffe this weekend when I went to the zoo. Cool. This type of connection is usually the easiest to teach. Students tend to do it naturally, right? Like, oh, that kid has a red shirt. In the book, I'm wearing a red shirt as well. Even kindergartners can make these types of connections. Now, I also mentioned that sometimes it's easier to get kids to make superficial connections when we're talking text to self. And when I say superficial, I mean like, oh, in the book there's a dog, I have a dog. Okay, you have a dog, great, that's a good place to start. But once kids can produce those types of connections, I want them to dig a little bit deeper. So I might ask a guiding question like, oh, you have a dog too. So, you know, what does that help you predict about what the character is going to do in the story? Or how does that help you understand what the character might be feeling for her dog? So get them to dig a little bit deeper and really go beyond just, oh, there's a dog, I have a dog, right? So text to self is the easiest one to get going on, but it can be a little bit harder to get the kids to make more profound or more meaningful connections. Let me know in the comments right now, have you ever had students who made really superficial text to self connections, like they weren't actually helping them comprehend the text, it was just kind of surface level? Just type yes in the comments if you've ever experienced that. I know that it's something I've experienced a lot, and probably a lot of other teachers have as well. All right, so moving right along to text connections. In these types of connections, as you probably guessed, students are making connections between 2 different texts. They might notice similarities between the topics, like if it's 2 nonfiction books on something similar or the same thing. Maybe the author or illustrator is the same. Maybe there are similar events in the text, or the plots are somehow somehow similar, or maybe the characters are somehow related, or maybe it's a series where the characters are the same in all of the text. So there's lots of different ways that students might make text to text connections, and these are really good connections to make. Again, we want to make sure that they're not just surface level, and so that's where we might have to ask some questions, like I was talking about with the text to self connections, to really get them to think about, okay, how is this connection helping me better understand the story, or whatever text you're reading if it's nonfiction. You can make all of these, by the way, with fiction or nonfiction text. They just look different depending on what genre you're working on. So an example of a text to text connection would be like, maybe the class is reading a poem about falling leaves, and a student says, oh, you know what, this makes me think of the book we read about the changing season. So they're making that connection. You can also guide kids in making text-to-text connections because you can intentionally choose books. Like you might choose that poem about falling leaves right after, later in the week, you read a book about the changing season. So you can be really selective to help guide kids in making those text-to-text connections. The third type of connection is text-to-world connections, and these are actually some of the most challenging connections for kids to make, especially in the primary grades. Kids that are young have a lot of like text-to-self experiences, and as they read more books or listen to more books, they have more text-to-text connections that they can make. But for a text-to-world connection, students are thinking of like real life events or social issues, like things happening in the world. And so with little ones, it might be a bit harder for them to make these connections, but you can also, just like you can kind of set kids up to make text-to-text connections, you can also, find some kid-friendly news stories or little clips or whatever. You can kind of set them up to make these connections. Kids might also have learned about these topics, especially as they get older, from TV or from the internet, or even just hearing adults in their own lives talk, or from hearing you talk about something that happened in the world. So, for example, here's something that a student might make that qualifies as text-to-world. Let's say that you're reading a story about a family that's really struggling to make ends meet, and a student says, you know what, on the news this morning, I also saw a family who was needing some things. Their house burned down because they were in a fire, and so they were trying to get donations. So that's an example of a text-to-world connection, and again, you can facilitate that by pulling out things, kid-friendly, appropriate news articles to read to them or little news clips, so you can help them make these types of connections. In the primary grades, you're probably going to focus more on text-to-self and really text-to-text, I would say. Okay, so now let's talk about how to actually teach kids to make these connections. So number one, as you probably already know, you're going to want to do some modeling. So as you're doing like a read aloud or shared reading, you might say something like, as we were reading this, it just made me think about when I went to Arizona and I saw a mountain for the first time. I remember there was a little bit of snow on top of that mountain, which helps me understand that it may get colder as you go up a mountain. And that helped me understand XYZ in the story. So not just, I saw a mountain, there's a mountain in the book, but I saw a mountain and there was snow at the top. That helps me understand, as you go up the mountain, it's getting colder and colder. So a meaningful text-to-self connection, or a meaningful whatever kind of connection you're making. So that is one thing you want to do, is you want to model for sure. And you may want to incorporate some nonverbal symbols so that students can make connections as you're reading without interrupting the lesson. With text-to-self connections, there's this thing you can do. I actually first started doing this with number talks for number sense in the primary grades. But if a child makes a connection, or if they see something in the book that they're connecting to, instead of raising their hand and saying, oh, I have this, or, I have this too, you can just have them go like this. This just means like me too. Okay. So you don't actually have to interrupt the lesson when you're having them, when you get to the point where you're beyond modeling and you're actually having them make connections. Of course, they can raise their hand. Can you make an anchor chart with their connections? Yes, you can do all of that good stuff, but also nonverbal signals may be helpful as well. So once you've modeled, you've had the kids practice. I prefer to do it during like read alouds, but of course, eventually you can have them do it in small group. Make some posters or some anchor charts around the room so that kids are reminded that they are supposed to be continually making connections as they read independently. So for example, you could have all types of connections on one anchor chart: text-to-text, text-to-self, text-to-text, text-to-world. That's a mouthful. But you could also have 3 different anchor charts, like a whole chart for text to self, and you could have actually like pictures, right? Especially if you're working with little ones, you might have little sketches or just examples of text to self connections that the kids actually made while you were reading a story or while you were reading them in text. So the anchor charts are created as you're doing a lesson, but then they go up on the wall as like just a reminder that, hey, we did this when we were doing it, when we were reading together, and now I want you to do this on your own. Same thing with text to text. You could actually go online and like print out little images of book covers, and on the text to text anchor chart, you could glue those down, right? and, jot little notes about whatever text-to-text connections you made while you were reading those texts. This is a tongue twister. This video is a tongue twister. But those little book covers could be a good one. And then text to world, same kind of thing. You could go online and print out little photos of like current events or things that you went over with the students, and then maybe like also little book cover images to remind them of the connections they made. So again, these anchor chart examples that I'm talking about would be made during the lesson, so they're meaningful. It's not like you prepare this and you just stick it on the wall. You make them as you're reading. You can always add on a little bit more later, like with printing out those photos and things that I mentioned, but you make them as a group and then they go up on the wall. And the purpose for that is to get kids to continue making connections throughout, independent reading, small group, et cetera, because it's not like this is something we do once and we're done. Okay, now some of your students may struggle to make connections, and that's totally normal, especially in the primary grades. So there are some things you can say to them to help facilitate making meaningful connections. So text to self is pretty basic. Just say, has anything like that ever happened to you? And you choose a book where it's a common thing, like falling off a bike or getting hurt or something that happens to most kids, right? Or tell me about a time when you felt happy, or tell me about a time when you went to the doctor. How is that similar to what happened in this text, right? So those prompts can facilitate them in making text to self connections. And when they respond to you, you name what they did. And you don't just say, oh yeah, this is like, when you went to the doctor, whatever. You say, yes, you made a text to self connection. That helped you understand that XYZ in the story, right? So you name what they did, even if you're kind of guiding them into making that connection. Now, text-to-text connections. Number one, you might ask them something like, hey, does this remind you of any other books we've read? Or you might actually have a basket. Hey, does this remind you of any of these books? You might need to give them a little bit of guidance. You might need to say something like, does this character remind you, or do these characters' traits, do they remind you of any other characters you've read about? Or does the problem in the story remind you of any other characters you read about? Or does this illustrator, do the illustrations in this book look similar to another book we've read, right? So you can ask those guiding questions. And then again, once they make those connections, you want to say to them, hey, you just made a text-to-text connection. You noticed that XYZ. So name what they did. Last but not least, for text to world, you might say something like, does this remind you of anything you've heard about or seen? And these are a little bit harder. You would probably, just because you don't necessarily know what the kids have heard about or seen, because you can ask that question, but you might also have to be more specific, like, we learned about blank. We learned about, I don't know, like the wildfires in California or something. How does this text relate to those wildfires? So you might actually have to pick out specific things and give them a little bit more guidance for text to world connections. All right, so I hope this was helpful to you. I have lots more reading comprehension activities and lesson plans to guide you in guiding your kids in making connections and practicing so many other reading comprehension skills. I'm going to include a link to the reading comprehension strategies curriculum for K1. Again, it'll give you a lot of guidance in these types of connections and lots more other skills. Look for that link, and of course, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. All right, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.